On a sweltering August eve in 1851, deep amid the decaying sugarcane fields of Bayou La Fourche, Louisiana, a trader's worn ledger marked a line that would linger unexplained. The words whispered, "One soul aged near about 19. Fetched from New Orleans auction. Rare bodily traits. Sum 28470. Nigh fourfold the common toll." The claimant's mark was Beaumont Thibodeau, Lord of Magnolia Grove. What unfolded in the coming 14 months birthed 3 passings: the forsaken ruin of a once thriving spread, and the deliberate burning of every scrap tied to the Grove's deeds in that span. Parish ledgers from Terrebonne show that come November 1852, the land was hawked at bid for a pittance of its worth, with the vow that some chambers stay barred forever. Local chroniclers unearthed 17 veiled nods to the Thibodeau woe in hidden missives and journals from Theage. Yet every formal trace was purged. The scant lingering tales mourn an affliction so devouring it withered all in its grasp. An affliction sparked by one lone-bound soul whose mere being defied every creed of the era. Before we tread further into the lament of Magnolia Grove and the shadowed bargain that cursed the Thibodeaucan, if you're drawn to the blackest folds of American sorrow, the ones they sought to bury, be certain you're bound to Liturgy of Fear. Press that subscribe and the warning chime so you miss no woes like this. And I'm wondering, where do you heed from? Cast your parish or hamlet in the echoes below. Now let's unveil what truly stirred behind the latched gates of Magnolia Grove and why 3 souls perished to veil. The reckoning of that fall is far more harrowing than any ghostly yarn could conjure. Bayou La Fourche in 1851 was a realm apart. A mosaic of sprawling plantations cleaved by thickets of cypress and willow, linked by muddied paths that swelled to crimson slurry when the harvest rains fell. This was sugarcane soil, where riches rose on the spines of bound toilers, and a man's measure was in spans and owned flesh. The mist hung heavy here, dense with dampness and the bitter tang of cane stalks drying in the smokehouses. Magnolia Grove perched on the western rim of Terrebonne Parish, a 30,000-acre hold that had clung to the Thibodeau line since 1783. The great house was a Creole manor of faded plaster, with iron balconies and weathered louvers, grand yet weary, suiting a bloodline that revered old coin and elder rights. 42 bound folk tended the grounds, dwelling in twin lines of shacks that trailed the great house like a forsaken hamlet of their kin. Beaumont Thibodeau was 37 that summer, a lanky figure with the polished lines bred from ages of choosy unions among Louisiana's planter breed. He claimed Magnolia 7 years prior at his sire's departing, with heavy burdens he labored ceaseless to redeem. By all reckonings, he was stern yet not overly harsh a keeper. He ruled his domain with the chill precision demanded of thriving lords, no kinder nor fiercer than his kin in his handling of those he held. His bride, Evangeline, was 10 years his lesser, spawn of a Baton Rouge trader who amassed wealth in the River Hall. She had wed Beaumont in 1847, bearing a hefty dowry that had eased the Grove's woes. Evangeline was deemed a rare grace, slender and ghostly, with raven locks styled in the ornate twists favored by Louisiana gentry. But frailty clung to her, hinting she might crumble at the faintest strain. She bore a lifeless heir in 1849, and the void altered her in manners that troubled the scarce souls near enough to heed. She lingered long in her upper parlor, perusing tomes and gazing beyond at the marshes afar. The Thibodeau kin lived the path ordained for their station. They graced Dessin, Annes and Houma, feasted kinfolk planters, and upheld the lavish customs that sustained Louisiana's planter elite. Beaumont held the parish seat and judged as overseer. Evangeline marshaled mercy guilds and oversaw the house, bound with aloof command. Outwardly, all seemed righteous, a flourishing grove steered by upright folk who knew their perch in the order. But under that veil, both Beaumont and Evangeline Thibodeau were sorely grieved in ways they could ne'er voice. Even inward, Beaumont sensed a gnawing hollow no triumph could sate. Evangeline felt unseen, ebbing further each dawn. They were 2 souls treading separate trails in the same abode, scarcely brushing, scarcely beholding one another. It was into this hush of quiet despair that the traitor Silas Crow appeared on the morn of August 14th, 1851. Crow was a regular shadow on the groves of Bayou La Fourche, a gaunt soul with keen edges and keener gaze, ever clad in a threadbare black coat. He dealt in what he termed rare finds, bound with peculiar talents or odd marks that might fetch high coin from affluent seekers. He had roamed the Gulf ports for the last 6 moons, haunting every grand auction from Mobile to Galveston, seeking stock that would tempt his choicest patrons. Beaumont met him in the Grove's office, alone shed apart from the great house where dealing stirred. Crow took a sip of bourbon and chatted idly on cane yields and the stern strife. Unease thickened the air those days, quarrels overlands and bondage that set wise men wary of tomorrow. Then he bent close, his tone slip into secrecy. "I've come by something queer, Mr. Thibodeau. Something I reckon might steer a man of your refinement." Beaumont arched a brow. "I ain't seeking extra field soles presently, Mr. Crow. This ain't no field sole." Crow drew a creased sheet from his vest, a deed with fine scribbles. "This is a singular find claimed 3 weeks back at the New Orleans market. The prior holder was a healer, Dr. Elias Blackwood, who gained this bound from a legacy sale in Baton Rouge. The soul was reared indoors. Schooled somewhat, can decipher and scribe, which is rare. But that ain't the peculiarity." He halted, eyeing Beaumont's visage close. "This bound is what healers name a hermaphrodite, formed with bodily signs of both man and woman. It's a true healer's wonder, the sort you witness maybe once in 1,000 births." Dr. Blackwood noted the state afore his ending. "The bound is hale now, youthful, maybe 19 or 20. I'm cleared to tender it for trade to the fittin' claimant for the fittin' sum." Beaumont sensed a tilt within, a feelin' like tumblin', both man and woman, neither pure nor t'other, a flawless riddle. "The bound has been schooled from youth to yield to healer's gaze," Dr. Blackwood assured utter yieldin'. "It grasps its rare form and has learned to shun defiance." Crow's grin turned wise. "I'm seeking 2.47, far o'er market, but ponder what you claim. This is a true marvel and beyond mere scholarly gaze." He let the words drift in the haze. Beaumont felt his throat parch. He pondered Evangeline above, staring into void. He pondered his own choking void. "I'll need to behold the bound first. Surely the cart waits yonder." 20 minutes on, Beaumont Thibodeau lingered in the office, gazing at Rowan for the first. The bound stood in the threshold, palms joined, gaze lowered in the bow of surrender that every bound soul learned from cradle. Rowan wore a plain linen garb that hid much, but even from afar the room, Beaumont could discern what Crow had murmured. The odd riddle that shunned simple sortin'. The countenance was lovely, in a manner tied to neither sex wholly, fine traits with sharp cheek ridges, plump lips, vast dark eyes rimmed by thick fringes. The locks were ebony, shorn brief. The form beneath the garb hinted bends that might be womanly, or might be something altogether else. The palms were lithe, the bare soles slim and shapely, but it was the timbre that truly seized the impossible essence of this soul's being. When Crow bade Rowan utter, what rose was a tone pitched betwixt man and woman realms belonging wholly to nither. "My name is Rowan, master. I'm 19. I can read, write, androcon. I have been schooled to yield to healer's probe without strife. I am dutiful and eager to heed." The phrases were plainly drilled, given with the dull hue of one who had learned to quell all self. But Beaumont heard something beneath, a soft wisdom, a knowing that this soul grasped precisely what they were and what was bartered. Beaumont gazed, unable to avert from this soul who seemed to dwell in some forbidden gap between sorts. He felt a captivation swelling in him that he couldn't wholly grasp, a hunger to fathom this enigma before him. "I'll claim it," he heard his own voice murmur. The barter sealed within the hour. Crow took a banknote, passed the scrolls, and vanished with the poise of a soul who had struck fine trade. Beaumont stood solitary in the office with his fresh claim, feeling thrill and dread in equal share. "Follow me," he uttered at last. "I must settle where you'll dwell." He led Rowan not to the bound quarters trailing the great house. Instead, he guided the bound to a wee cabin that huddled at the garden's fringe, a shell that once sheltered his sire's attendant, but had loomed vacant forages. It was remote enough for seclusion, yet near enough to the great house for ease. "You'll abide here," Beaumont said. "I'll call when I've set your labors." Rowan stood in the heart of the cabin's lone chamber, palms still joined, visage blank. "Yes, master." Beaumont returned to the great house, his thoughts churning. That evening at supper he told Evangeline of the claim, weighing his words. He painted Rowan as an rarely schooled house bound with a shadowed past that he had claimed as a likely aid to the household fold. Evangeline showed scant heed at first, pecking at her fare. "If you deem it fittin', Beaumont, the bound bears uncommon marks." The prior keeper was a healer who prized the bound for mender's cause. It might serve to hold someone with such schoolin' in the abode. Something in his murmur made Evangeline glance up, probing his visage. "What manner of marks?" Beaumont paused. "It's hard to voice. Perhaps you should witness yourself." The next dawn, he led Evangeline to the cabin to greet Rowan. Evangeline stood in the threshold, gazing at the bound with early indifference that slowly twisted into something else as she drank in Rowan's form. The riddled grace, the hard-to-sort aura, the odd essence of dwelling betwixt realms. "This is Rowan," Beaumont said, watching his bride's countenance. "The bound I spoke of." Evangeline drew nearer, circling Rowan slow, her mien veiled. Rowan stood utterly still, gaze lowered, breathing even and deep. "What precisely makes this bound so queer?" Evangeline queried. Beaumont explained, keeping his tone Mender's, describing Rowan's state in healer's terms. As he uttered, he watched something shift in Evangeline's mien. The same captivation he had sensed, the same troubled wonder. When he ceased, Evangeline was hushed for a long breath. Then she stretched forth, her palm hovering near Rowan's countenance before dropping to her flank. May I probe myself to fathom?" Beaumont felt his pulse quicken. "If you desire." What unfolded in that cabin over the ensuing hour would herald their fall. Evangeline's probe began with Mender's wonder, studying Rowan's countenance, the bound's palms, posing queries on Dr. Blackwood's scrolls, but slowly, near unseen, it turned to something else. Something neither Beaumont nor Evangeline could name, but both knew. When they at last left the cabin and returned to the great house, they spoke not of what had passed. But that night, for the first in moons, they joined in their wedded bed, pulled to one another, not by tenderness or warmth, but by a shared veil. A shared captivation with the impossible soul who now dwelt in the cabin past their garden. It was the dawn of an affliction that would swallow them both. The fall of 1851 in Terrebonne Parish brought chillier winds and the grim toil of sugarcane reap. But inside Magnolia Grove, something far more grievous took root. Within a week of Rowan's coming, a fresh rhythm had set, one that the other bound folk on the grounds noted straight, even if they grasped it not wholly. Rowan was shifted from the cabin to a wee chamber on the third level of the great house, named as Evangeline's own attendant. The bound was granted fresh garb, finer victuals than the field souls got, and seemed to linger in a queer favored seclusion from the rest of the bound kin. But the other bound saw things that grieved them. They saw how the Lord and Lady would both vanish above at strange hours. They heard murmurs through the planks that were hard to decipher. They noted how Rowan would emerge from that third-level chamber, treading wary, visage empty, eyes afar. Bess, the Grove's cook, was among the first to sense something deeply awry. She had toiled at Magnolia for 20 years, witnessed 3 Thibodeau lines, and had honed the sharp sight needed for endurance in her lot. She noted how Beaumont had ceased ruling the Grove rightly, how debts stacked on his desk unsealed, how he would forsake gatherings with kin planters. She noted how Evangeline had ceased eating proper, growing frailer and ghostlier by the week, locked hours in that third-level chamber. One morning in late September, Bess sought to speak with Rowan in the kitchen. The younger bound had descended to fetch morn meal for the Lord and Lady, moving with that queer, wary step, visage showing naught. "Child," Bess murmured low, glancing round to ensure solitude. "Are they wounding you up yonder? You can confide in me. I've lingered long enough to know when something ain't true." Rowan gazed at her with those veiled eyes. "I hold all I require, Aunt Bess. The Lord and Lady tend me fair." "That ain't what I queried." A glint of something crossed Rowan's visage so swift Bess near missed it. "Ache, maybe, or yieldin'." Then it vanished, swapped by that wary void. "I fulfill what I was birthed to fulfill," Rowan whispered. "What I was schooled to. It's simpler when you shouldn't ponderin'." Before Bess could answer, steps echoed on the stairs above. Rowan gathered them on tray and faded back above, leaving Bess solitary in the kitchen with a queasy knot in her gut. The murmurs stirred in the bound quarters that eve. Folk uttered in hushed tones about the queer fresh bound who ne'er joined them at dusk, who ne'er graced the hidden prayer gatherings in the bayou, who seemed to dwell in some severed realm holy. Some elder bound recalled yarns of conjure and root work, about souls birthed with strange gifts who could ensnare their keepers. Others shunned such as folly, but couldn't unravel what stirred in the great house any finer. Meanwhile, above in that third-floor chamber, Beaumont and Evangeline were unearthing depths to their affliction that neither had dreamed feasible. Beaumont had gathered tomes on flesh and mender's lore, scrolls that spoke rare ailments and odd cases. He would linger hours poring these books, then weighing what he gleaned to his sightings of Rowan. He began keeping a ledger, though its innards strayed far from the precise Grove tallies he had upheld for years. This ledger was barred in a drawer, veiled even from Evangeline, brimming with notes and etchings that would later be raised. Evangeline's captivation shaped different. She would linger whole afternoons in Rowan's chamber, bidden the bound garb and disrobe again and again, shaping Rowan's locks in varied modes, seeking to fathom this soul who seemed to sway between sorts dependent on attire and mien. She ordered fresh raiment from a stitcher in Huma, some shaped in womanly cuts, others more manly, all crafted to heighten or veil Rowan's riddled shape. "I yearn to fathom what you are," Evangeline told Rowan one afternoon. If you're truly both or neither or something else holy, Rowan, standing still as Evangeline mended a frock neck, answered in that wary, even tone, "Does it signify, lady? I am what you behold, what you crave to behold. But what do you behold when you gaze at yourself?" For a breath, Rowan's veil slipped. "I behold what all have ever beheld, something to be probed, something to be fathomed, something that lingers only to sate others' wonder." Evangeline's palm stilled. "That's not, I don't aim to." But she couldn't end the phrase, for they both knew it was precisely what she aimed, what both she and Beaumont aimed. Every time they called Rowan to that chamber, every time they probed and queried and sought to sort what could not be sorted. As September faded to October, the abode settled into a pattern that seemed near normal from without. Beaumont ruled the grove with rote command when he deigned to rule at all. Evangeline upheld her gentry duties when utterly needed, though she shunned more calls than she heeded. The other bound went about their toil, murmuring among kin, but wise enough not to challenge their lord's ways openly. But those who heeded could see the signs of rot. Beaumont had shed flesh, his garb dangling loose on his frame. His eyes had gained a fevered gleam, and he scarce slept more than scant hours afore rising to pace the corridors or withdraw to his study. Evangeline had ceased her ornate frocks, choosing plain dark robes that draped her growing bony form. Her locks, once her glory, were oft left in a simple bind, unclean for days. And Rowan lingered as afore, serene, void, dutiful, treading the house like a spectre, uttering only when uttered to, dwelling in that queer threshold space between soul and chattel, between keeper and bound, between the breathing and something that merely endured. It was in late October that the first true woe struck. Two field souls, kin named Reuben and Levi, sought to flee. They were snared by watchers 15 miles from the grove and dragged back in irons. Beaumont, roused from his afflictive studies, was compelled to handle the matter as grove order demanded. He had them lashed, 10 strokes each, dealt afore the gathered bound as a caution to others. But his spirit wasn't in it. He beheld the chastisement with distant gaze, his thoughts plainly elsewhere, after it ended, and the other bound had been sent to their shacks. He stood solitary in the yard, gazing at Thelish post with a mien that might have been remorse or might have been naught at all. Bess, watching from the kitchen pane, saw him there and grasped something core. The Lord wasn't just afflicted with Rowan. He was vanishing into that affliction, growing less real with each passing day, less tied to the realm of common mortal cares. That night she heard the Lord and Lady in the third-floor chamber again. But this time, through the planks and floors, she heard something fresh. Lifted tones, a quarrel. The words weren't clear, but the feeling was plain. Wrath, maybe, or despair. The next morn, Rowan came to the kitchen forlorn meal, treading even more wary than usual. Bess said naught, but when their gazes met across the kitchen, she saw something in Rowan's mien that chilled her deep. It was the gaze of one who knew precisely how this would cease, and had yielded to it. November came with untimely chill gusts that stripped the last fronds from the willows and set the bound toilers scrambling to brace for winter. But inside Magnolia Grove, a different chill had settled, the icy hush of an abode coming undone at the seams. The grove was failing. Not openly, not yet, but those who knew such could see the marks. Fields that should have been sown with winter grain lay barren. Barriers needed mending, but stayed shattered. The cane from the prior reap sat in the sheds, much of it unhawked, for Beaumont had failed to barter packs with seekers in Baton Rouge. Debts piled on his desk, many unsealed, some moons past due. Kin planters began to heed. They murmured among kin about Beaumont Thibodeau's absence from chapel, his shunning of parish councils, the way he would heed supper calls, then send regrets at the final hour. Some blamed it on sorrow or his lady's lingering frailty. Others whispered of coin woes or spirits. None guessed the truth, for the truth was too queer for their realm to hold. Evangeline had ceased even feigning her gentry duties. She scarce left the great house, and when she did stray to the garden or nearby trails, she tread like a woman strolling in slumber. Her kin from the Mercy Guild ceased visiting after their calls were oft turned away by attendants with courteous excuses. The preacher from St. Anne's came once to query her state and was told she was ailing. He left looking grieved but returned not. The bound folk on the grounds grasped in the way the powerless ever grasped the mighty that something was deeply amiss. The carefully held gap between lord and bound had crumbled in ways that unease all. Beaumont no longer scanned the toil or gave clear bids. Evangeline no longer ruled the abode with her old command. The grove ran on sway, and the drive of the bound themselves who grasped that their endurance hung on upholding rhythms even when their lords had forsaken them. And then there was Rowan. The other bound folk had first eyed Rowan with doubt tinged with dread. This outsider fetched from afar, who dwelt in the great house, who seemed to hold some unvoiced sway over the lord and lady. But as weeks turned to moons, doubt grew into something nearer pity. They saw how Rowan lingered in a sort of cage, severed from the kin in the shacks, bound into a part none could wholly fathom, but all knew as deeply wrong. Some of the women sought to reach. Lula, who had been Evangeline's attendant afore Rowan came, neared the younger bound one afternoon when they crossed in the corridor. "If you need aught," Lula murmured low. "If you need one to utter to, or, I don't know, just know you ain't solitary here." Rowan gazed at her with those wary, shielded eyes. "Thank you, but I am solitary. We all are in the end." The reply came without woe, merely as truth stated. Lula watched Rowan treading down the corridor and felt a deep sorrow that had naught to do with her own lot, and all to do with seeing suffering she was helpless to ease. By late November, Beaumont had begun to withdraw even from Rowan. The nightly calls to the third-floor chamber grew scarcer. He would linger long hours in his study instead, sipping bourbon and gazing at the barred ledger he no longer scribed in, as if replies to queries he couldn't voice might somehow rise in its leaves. Evangeline filled the gap. She lingered whole days in Rowan's chamber now, scarce eaten, scarce slumbering, locked into an affliction that had swallowed whatever else had once dwelled in her life. She would utter to Rowan for hours, wandering soliloquies about her youth in Baton Rouge, her union, the child she had lost, her sense that she'd somehow faltered at the core duty of being a woman. Rowan heeded with that same wary care, answering when bade, offering no blame or solace. Sometimes Evangeline would drift to sleep in the seat by the pane, and Rowan would drape her with a cover and sit utterly still until she stirred hours later, lost and muddled about where she lingered. "Why do you abide?" Evangeline queried one afternoon. "You could flee. Reuben and Levi tried. You're wise enough to hold better odds than they." "And flee where, lady?" "I was birthed marked a Sother. Everywhere I tread, folks see that otherness and crave to fathom it, to probe it, to claim it. At least here I know what awaits." "That's dreadful," Evangeline breathed. "Yes, lady, it is." It was during one of these long afternoons that Evangeline at last voiced the query that had swelled in her mind for moons. "Do you despise us, Beaumont and me?" Rowan was hushed for a long breath. When the bound finally uttered, it was with careful weighing, as if balancing each word. "Despise demands a freedom I lack. Lady, to despise you, I would need to hold I merited something else, that I claimed right to be seen as wholly human. But I was schooled from cradle that I lack that right, that my queer nature makes me something lesser than human, something to be studied and shown. So no, I don't despise you. I don't. I merely endure you the same as I've endured all afore you and will endure all who follow." Evangeline began to weep, then deep tearing sobs that seemed to rise from somewhere root. Rowan sat still, offering no solace, merely bearing witness to the lady's shatter with that same wary evenness. When Evangeline at last gathered herself, her visage was marred and her eyes crimson. "I reckon we're ruining ourselves," she uttered. "Beaumont and I, this affliction with you. It's like a plague devouring us from within." "Yes, lady. And you're just beholding it unfold. What else can I do?" Evangeline had no reply. The woe that had built for moons finally crested on December 15th when Dr. Ambrose Caldwell reached Magnolia Grove. Dr. Caldwell was a mender from Baton Rouge, an oldkin of Beaumont's sire, who had scribed to Beaumont weeks prior, offering sorrows on some trade troubles he'd heard through shared ties. Beaumont, in a breath of frailty and dire need to sanctify his affliction, had replied mentioning his claim of a mender's wonder, and bidden Caldwell to visit and lend his learned view. He came in the afternoon, a stout soul in his 60s, with white side whiskers and the sure stance of one who had spent 40 years yielded to his sage. Beaumont greeted him with a zeal that seemed strained, near wild. Evangeline stayed above, claiming ache. They supped together that eve, and Beaumont uttered with scarce-held thrill about Rowan, wary at first, using Mender's words and speaking the scarcity of true hermaphroditism, but slowly growing more lively, more barren of his captivation. Caldwell heeded with learned heed that slowly turned to something more grieved as the eve wore. "I would be keen to probe this bound," Caldwell uttered at last. "If you're willing, surely. That's why I bade you. I prize your wisdom, your learned gauge of the matter." Something in Beaumont's tone made Caldwell halt. "The matter?" Beaumont seemed to rein himself. "The ailment, the scrolls from the prior keeper were vast, but I would cherish a second view from one of your stature." After supper, Beaumont led Caldwell to Rowan's chamber. Evangeline was already there, seated in her seat by the pane, looking like a wraith in her dark robe. Rowan stood by the door, palms joined, visage carefully even. "This is Rowan," Beaumont said, his tone taking that mender's hue he used when trying to hold distance from his affliction. "The bound I noted in my scroll." Caldwell neared Rowan with learned remove, posing queries on age, general hail, the bounds past afore coming to Magnolia. Rowan answered in that careful drilled way, given knowledge without tone or feeling. "May I lead a brief fleshly probe?" Caldwell queried. "Nothing piercing, merely an outer sight to weigh the state," Mr. Thibodeau spoke. Rowan glanced at Beaumont, who nodded. "Surely, Doctor." Rowan is used to Mender's probe. What followed was a learned honoring gauge that stood sharp against what had stirred in that chamber for the past 4 moons. Caldwell probed Rowan's countenance, palms, bade the bound turn slow, made scant notes in a wee book he bore. His probe was full but worthy, treating Rowan as a sufferer rather than a find. When he ceased, his mien had shifted from Mender's heed to something more layered, a blend of learned wonder and deep personal grief. "Wondrous," he murmured soft, "a true case of hermaphroditism. Scarce indeed." He gazed at Beaumont, then at Evangeline, seated still in her seat. "Might I utter with you alone, Mr. Thibodeau?" They withdrew to Beaumont's study, leaving Evangeline and Rowan solitary above. Caldwell took a brandy and stood by the hearth, choosing his words with clear care. "Beaumont, I've known your kin for many years. I honored your sire despite his trials, which is why I must utter plain now as kin and as mender." Beaumont felt his gut tighten with fear. "What is it?" "That bound above is indeed a true hermaphrodite. The state is as scarce as you hinted. From a pure mender's stance, it would stir great heed in scholars." Caldwell halted, his gaze grave. "But Beaumont, what grieves me is not the bound's state. What grieves me is the air in that chamber. The way you and your bride gaze at that soul. The strain, the affliction I sense beneath your words." Beaumont felt his visage heat. "I don't grasp what you're hinting." "I'm hinting that you've grown perilously fixed on this bound in a manner that strays far beyond mender's or scholarly heed. Your grove is failing. I could see that on my path up the lane. Your bride looks like she'n't slumbered right in moons. You yourself seem—" He halted, seeking the fit word. "Devoured. This ain't hail, Beaumont. Whatever stirs here must cease afore it ruins you." "Rowan is my chattel," Beaumont said, his tone sharper than meant. "How I rule my chattel is my care. There are righteous bounds, Beaumont, even in handle and bound, and I fear you've crossed many." The utterance worsened from there. Beaumont grew garden, then wrathful. Caldwell stayed firm but merciful, trying to make Beaumont see what befell him and his bride, but Beaumont couldn't or wouldn't heed it. The affliction had sunk too deep. Caldwell left the next dawn, grieved and sure that something dreadful unfolded at Magnolia Grove. He pondered scribing to shared kin, maybe even to parish elders. But what to claim? That a man heeded a bound he held too much. That wasn't unlawful. Wasn't even queer in Louisiana in 1851. So Caldwell did not, and the chance to meddle passed. After his leaving, Beaumont and Evangeline spoke not of the call, but something had tilted. Caldwell's words had forced them to face, however brief, what they wrought, and that facing led not to shift. It led to despair, to a doubling in the affliction, as if by swallowing themselves wholly in it, they could somehow flee the remorse that began to taint all. January 1852 brought thick snows that severed Magnolia Grove from the outer realm for near 3 weeks. The sugarcane fields lay still under pale shrouds. The bound huddled in their shacks round smoky blazes, and inside the great house, Beaumont and Evangeline sank deeper into a shadow that neither could longer deny or flee. The seclusion seemed to hasten all. With no gentry duties to uphold, no means to keep, they forsook whatever reign had lingered. Beaumont ceased even feigning to rule the grove. Evangeline ceased leaving the 3rd level wholly. And Rowan simply endured as ever, dwelling in that queer threshold space between soul and thing, between the breathing and those who merely endured. But something had shifted in Rowan too. The bound had begun to utter more oft, not with defiance precise, but with a kind of quiet noting that made Beaumont and Evangeline growing uneasy. Rowan had learned that uttering could forge cracks in their surety, could sow doubt into their carefully built excuses. "You're wounding each other now, not just me," Rowan uttered one eve after. Evangeline had left the chamber in tears following a spat with Beaumont. "The affliction is devouring you both from the within." Beaumont, weary and rumpled, gazed at the bound with something near hatred. "What do you crave from me? Some nod that I've wronged you? Your chattel, Rowan. You linger to serve whatever end I set." "Is that what you whisper to yourself, Lord?" "Because from where I stand, it seems I'm the sole free soul in this chamber. You and the lady are bound to your cravings, to your hunger to claim something you can ne'er truly hold. I yield to you because the law grants me no path. But you yield to your afflictions because you've lost the gift to choose else. The word struck deeper than any fleshly blow could. Beaumont lifted his palm as if to strike, then let it drop. What chastisement could he deal that would mend the sway bond that had already fallen? What warning could he utter that would grant him back the reign he had lost? He left the chamber without further word. February brought a thaw but no ease from the strain inside Magnolia Grove. The bound folk in the shacks murmured ceaseless now, their guesses growing darker and more true. Several had begun planning flights, knowing something was sorely amiss and craving to be far when whatever built finally burst. Bess shunned bringing victuals to the third level anymore, forcing Evangeline to fetch meals herself or hunger. 2 more field souls sought to flee and were snared, but Beaumont scarce heeded when they were returned. The Watcher handled the chastisement without querying him, growing taken rein of daily deeds as the Lord withdrew further into his affliction. Evangeline had begun to waste visibly. She ate near naught, slumbered only in brief, restless spans, spent every wakened breath either in Rowan chamber or pacing the corridors like a spectre. Her kin from the mercy guilds, grieved by her long absence, sent scrolls that went unheeded. The preacher came again and was turned at the gate. "I see myself in you," Evangeline told Rowan one afternoon, her tone barely o'er a breath. Neither one nor t'other, neither fully quick nor fully gone, snared in some forbidden gap between. "No, lady," Rowan answered soft. "You see what you crave to see. I'm just a soul. Birthed other, yes, but still just a soul. It's you and the Lord who shaped me into something else. You turned me into a sign of your own muddle, your own feeling of being lost." Evangeline's palms shook as she wrapped her arms round herself. "But you are lost too. We're all lost here, perhaps. But I was lost long before I came to Magnolia Grove. You chose this. That's the gap." The abode attendants noted the shift in the lady. Lula, passing Evangeline in the corridor one morn, was stunned by what she beheld. The woman had become bony, her eyes sunken wild, her locks hanging loose and unclean. She'd read like one already half gone, stumbling from one breath to the next without any sense of aim or path. Beaumont was scarce better. He had ceased shaving, ceased changing his garb regular. He would roam the house at queer hours, muttering to himself, sometimes standing outside Rowan's door for long breaths without ever rapping. The attendants learned to shun him, to fade unseen when he passed, for there was something unsteady in his way now, something that hinted he might shatter at the faintest prod. The murmurs in the bound shacks had grown from guess to surety. Something dreadful was going to befall. All could sense it. That feel of coming ruin that hangs in the air afore a storm breaks. Folk began making ready, hiding wee stores of fare, mending souls in wait of flight, holding quiet utterances about which way offered the best odds of reaching free soil. It was Bess who at last sought to meddle, driven by a sense that if someone didn't act, blood would spill. She found Beaumont in his study late one afternoon, gazing at naught, a glass of bourbon forgotten in his palm. She stood in the threshold, gathering her mettle, knowing what she was about to do could see her hawked away or worse. "Lord Thibodeau," she uttered soft, "I need to utter plain with you." He glanced up slow as if returning from somewhere far distant. "What is it, Bess?" "This thing you and the lady got with that bound, Rowan. It ain't righteous, sir, and it's slaying all 3 of you. I can see it unfolding day by day. You gotta release that child. Hawk Rowan away. Send it bound elsewhere afore this whole abode crumbles." Beaumont gazed at her for a long breath. She braced for his wrath, for chastisement, for the harm lords could deal on bound hootered amiss. But instead something crumbled in his mien, and for just a breath she saw the truth scribed plain on his visage. He knew she was true, knew precisely what was befallen, and was helpless to halt it. "Depart, Bess," he uttered at last, his tone barely heard. "Just depart," she left, her heart thudding, knowing she had tried and failed. "If this tale is chilling your bones, share this vision with a kin who craves dark riddles. Press that like to bolster our lore, and don't forget to subscribe to miss no tales like this. Let's unearth together what befalls next, for the horror in Magnolia Grove is about to crest its dreadful end." The shattering came on February 14th, 1852. The day dawned like any in that abode of slow rot. Beaumont rose late, rumpled and hollow-gazed. Evangeline lingered above, having not left the third level in 3 days. Rowan tread through the rhythm of endurance, fetching water, handling the wee duties that upheld the veil of normal. But something differed. Those who knew Evangeline well, and the bound women who had served her for years knew her finer than any, could see that she had reached some kind of shatter point. There was a queer calm about her that morn, a stillness more frightening than her usual stir. Lula noted it when she passed the lady in the corridor. Evangeline's eyes, usually restless and fevered, had gained a glassy hue, as if she gazed at something distant far. She tread with deliberate slowness like one enacting a drilled rite. When Lula offered to bring her brew, Evangeline simply shook her head and tread on up the stairs without uttering. Bess noted it too, and the dread that had built in her breast for moons suddenly sharpened. She found herself praying quiet under breath as she toiled in the kitchen, that whatever came would pass swift and spare the blameless. By eve, a chill rain had begun to fall, drumming against the panes and turning the world without into a smear of gray damp. The chill dropped sharp and the gust howled round the house's edges, making the old frame creak and moan. It felt like the sort of night when dreadful things befell, when the common laws of the world halted themselves. Beaumont sat in his study, gazing at the blaze, sipping bourbon with roach steadiness. He had ceased trying to fathom what had befallen his life, ceased trying to excuse or sanctify. He simply lingered in a haze of spirits and weariness, waiting for something he couldn't name. Above, Evangeline sat in Rowan's chamber, watching the bound with an intensity that had grown familiar o'er the moons, but had now gained a desperate rim. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that swayed across the walls. Without, the rain sharpened, and somewhere afar, thunder grumbled. "I can't abide this anymore," she uttered sudden, her tone cracking. "I can't rise one more dawn in this abode, in this existence, knowing what we've become." Rowan, seated on the narrow cot, gazed at her with those careful, guarded eyes. "Then flee, lady. Take what coin you can and tread somewhere distant. Begin anew, begin anew." Evangeline laughed, a shattered sound with no mirth. "How do I begin anew when I bear this within? When every time I shut my eyes, I behold what we've wrought, what we've become. You don't grasp? There's no beginning anew from this. There's only end in it." Something in her tone made Rowan sit straighter, suddenly wary. "Lady, what do you mean?" Evangeline rose abrupt, pacing to the pane and back, her treads jerky and unruled. Rain lashed the glass and lightning brief lit her visage. Gaunt, haunted, already half gone. "I thought fathom would bring release. I thought if I could just grasp what you are, if I could unravel the riddle of your being, it would somehow unravel the riddle of my own void. But it's only worsened all. You were true. You're just a soul, and we shaped you into a sign of our own shatter. And I can't abide what that makes us, Evangeline." Rowan used the lady's name for the first, foregoing the careful rite of bondage. "Whatever you're pondering, cease. Utter to someone, the preacher, Amender, any who can aid you." "Aid me!" Evangeline's tone arose, gaining a wild rim. "Aid me what?" "Forget what we've wrought to you. Feign we're upright folk. We're not. We're fiends who used another human soul to fill the void within, and it failed. And now I'm empty all through." She tread to the chest with sudden aim, opened a drawer, and drew something that gleamed dull in the lamplight. A pistol. One of Beaumont's sire's dueling arms that she must have taken from the study days prior, hidden here, waiting for this breath. Rowan rose slow, palms lifted in a sign of peace. "Lady, please set that down. Why?" Evangeline turned to face Rowan, the arm held loose in her shaken palm. "So we can keep this. Keep ruining each other day by day. I'm weary, Rowan. I'm so weary of being quick. So weary of feeling Alan not at once." Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the abode. The lamp swayed wild, near extinguishing, then steadied. In that breath of shadow, Evangeline's visage looked like a skull, all sharp edges and hollow eyes. The door burst wide. Beaumont stood in the threshold, warned by Evangeline's lifted tone, damp dripping from his coat. He'd been standing without in the rain, likely for hours. His gaze fixed swift on the pistol in his bride's palm, and whatever haze of spirits and despair he'd dwelled in suddenly cleared. "Evangeline, what are you doing?" She turned to behold him, tears streaming down her wasted visage, mingling with the lamplight to make her skin seem to gleam. "I'm ending it, Beaumont. I'm halting this afore it strays further. Afore we ruin aught else, anyone else?" "Yield the arm." Beaumont tread into the chamber, palm outstretched, his tone gaining a careful, tender hue she hadn't heard in moons. "Please, Evangeline, whatever you're feeling, we can what?" She loved that shattered laugh again. "Mend this. Make it righteous. There's no making this righteous, Beaumont. We ruined this soul." She waved toward Rowan with the arm, the barrel swaying wild. "We're in each other. We ruined all we touched because we were too shattered to do else. Don't you behold? We're venom. All we touch turns ill and perishes." Rowan uttered then, tone serene despite the weapon aimed their way. "Evangeline, you're not a fiend. You're a soul who made dreadful choices. Yes, but you can still choose other. You can still tread away from this. Both of you can. It's not too late to... It is too late." The arm shook fierce in Evangeline's hold. "It's been too late since the day Beaumont fetched you here. Maybe it was too late years afore. When I wed a man I didn't cherish for coin I didn't crave. When I tried to be someone I wasn't. When I lost the child and grasped I'd ne'er be the soul all expected. Don't you grasp? I can't keep abiding like this. Every breath is torment. Every breath I'm awake. I behold what we are, what we've wrought, and I can't bear it anymore. Beaumont took another step forth, his visage pale, his palm still stretched. Evangeline, please ponder what you're doing. Ponder about. I have pondered it, she cried. I've pondered naught else for weeks. This is the only thing that signifies any more. The only choice I hold left that's truly mine. But Evangeline had ceased heeding her own words. Her visage had gained a queer peace, as if she'd at last made accord with the choice that had built 4 moons, maybe years. The shaking in her palms ceased. The wild gleam in her eyes calmed to something near serene. I'm sorrowful, she breathed, gazing straight at Rowan. For all of it. For everything we wrought to you. For what we shaped you into. For using you to shun beholden ourselves. Then, with motions that seemed to unfold in slow time, she turned the arm from Rowan and toward herself, pressing the barrel under her chin. No. Beaumont lunged forth, his fingers grasping for the weapon, but he was too slow, too late, too shattered himself to halt what came next. The sound of the shot was deafening in the wee chamber, seeming to press the air itself and make the lamplight blaze impossibly bright for one frozen breath. Evangeline's form fell back, striking the planks with a dreadful finality. Blood began to spread across the floorboards, dark and gleaming in the lamplight, pooling round her head like a grotesque crown. Beaumont dropped to his knees beside her, making sounds that were scarce human. Raw sorrow and horror that transcended utterance, beast cries of ache that no words could voice. His palms hovered o'er her form, craving to touch her, to hold her, but feared causing more harm, as if aught he did now could matter. Rowan remained standing by the pane, utterly still, visage showing a mien that might have been pity, or might have been ease, or might have been naught at all. Without, the rain lingered to fall, and thunder rolled across the dark sky, and the world endured as if naught had befallen. Below, the attendants had heard the shot. Bess stood frozen in the kitchen, her worst fears sealed, her prayers unheeded. Lula sat in her chamber with her palms o'er her mouth, fighting the urge to cry out. The other bound gathered in the corridor, murmuring urgent, trying to settle what to do, whether to flee or abide, whether this was the dawn of something worse, or the end of the nightmare they'd endured. Evangeline lingered for 17 more hours. The bullet had wrought dreadful harm, but hadn't slain her swift, leaving her hung betwixt life and death in a state beyond knowing or ache. She lay in her bed while Beaumont sat beside her, holding her palm, breathing sorrows she couldn't heed, begging pardon from one who was already gone, even though her heart still throbbed. Rowan brought water and clean cloths, tending to both lord and dying lady with quiet command, uttering naught, offering no solace or blame. The bound simply wrought the duties that needed wrought, dwelling in that known space of heed that craved no thought, no feeling nody with the horror unfolding. The abode mender came near midnight, called by one of the attendants. Beprobed Evangeline shook his head grave and told Beaumont there was naught to do but wait. The harm was too fierce, too deep in the mind. It was a wonder she had endured this long. When Beaumont queried if she was suffering, the mender assured him that no, she was beyond all suffering now, feeling naught, aware of naught, already more absent than here. Beaumont sent the mender away and returned to Evangeline's bedside, upholding his watch through the long shadow hours. Huttered to her, sometimes rambling confessions of guilt and grief and cherish that he had ne'er voiced when she could heed them. He told her of his own void, his own shatter, how he had thought she could sate the gap within him, and had been ruined to find she was just as hollow as he was. He told her he was sorrowful for fetching Rowan into their lives, sorrowful for starting them down a trail that couldn'tly end in ruin. But mostly he sat in hush, watching the rise and fall of her breast grow slower and shallower with each passing hour. As dawn light began to sift through the panes, gray and chill, matching the rain that still fell without, Evangeline's breathing shifted one final time. It grew labored, rattling, the sound of a form yielding its last grip on life. Beaumont leaned close, tears falling onto her pale visage, his palm gripping hers with desperate might. I'm sorrowful, he breathed one last time, for everything. For failing you? For all of it. Her eyes opened brief, clouded and unfocused, perhaps beholding him one last, perhaps beholding naught at all. Her lips stirred, forming words without sound, words he would ne'er know, tidings that perished unsent. Then she was gone. The dreadful rattling breath ceased. Her palm went limp in his. The slight warmth that had lingered in her skin began to fade, swapped by the chill that claimed all the departed. Beaumont sat with her form for hours after, unable to stir, unable to ponder, unable to feel aught except a vast void that seemed to swallow all. Not just Evangeline, not just himself, but the whole world, the whole cosmos, all collapsing into a gap that had no base and no cease. Finally, Rowan uttered from the threshold, tone quiet and even. "Lord, we need to call for aid. The attendants, the mender. Someone needs to be told." Beaumont glanced up at the bound, his visage ravaged by sorrow and remorse. His eyes crimson from weeping, his palms still clutching his dead bride's coolin' fingers. And in that breath, unable to bear the weight of his own blame, he lashed at the only mark of ale. "This is your doing," he uttered, his tone flat and gone. "You wrought this on us. You ruined all." Rowan met his gaze steady, neither shrinking nor quarreling, simply taking the charge with the same wary evenness that had marked every tie. "No, Lord, you wrought this on yourselves. I was just here." The words hung in the air betwixt them, simple, undeniable, ruining in their truth. Beaumont had no answer. He turned back to Evangeline's form and uttered naught more. The aftermath unfolded with grim certainty, each step following logical from what came afore, like a reckoning proof leading to an inescapable end. Beaumont claimed Evangeline's passing was mishap, a grievous ill luck that befell while she handled one of his sire's old arms. Not grasping it was charged. The local overseer, a soul who had known Beaumont since youth and who grasped the tangles that self-slaying wrought for upright kin, took this tale with clear ease. He led a brief probe that posed no hard queries and reached the end all craved. Self-slaying was shameful, lawful tangle, troublesome for the capel and for legacy. Mishap was simpler for all tied. The rites were held 3 days later at St. Anne's in Huma, well graced by kin planters and their brides, who came to honor one of their breed. They stood in the chill rain and uttered in hushed, merciful tones about the woe of a youthful woman taken afore her time. They noted how ruined Beaumont seemed, how he had aged years and recent moons, how sorrow had hollowed him till he seemed scarce real. They offered their sorrows with true feeling. These folk who had known the Thibodeau for ages, who had no notion what had truly stirred behind the barred doors of Magnolia Grove, none knew the truth or if some guessed. If they had heeded Beaumont's growing withdrawal from gentry, Evangeline's queer ways, the murmured tales that had begun spreading among the bound kin, they had the wise sense not to utter it. Some queries were better unqueried in Louisiana in 1852. Some answers were too grieving to claim, but the bound kin knew. They ever knew. In the shacks at Magnolia and on kin groves, in breathed utterances after the lords had slumbered, the truth flowed through the unseen web that linked Louisiana's bound folk. The tale of what had befallen at Magnolia Grove spread and swelled in the telling, gaining mythic spans as it passed from lip to lip, becoming a warning yarn about the rotten essence of utter sway, and what befell when lords treated bound folk not as human souls, but as things to sate their cravings. They uttered of Rowan, the queer bound, neither man nor woman, who had somehow driven the Thibodeau to ruin simply by being. Some versions of the tale hinted Rowan held special gifts, some conjure or root work that made lords lose their minds. Others claimed Rowan had been so lovely, so impossibly drawn, that even pious folk couldn't shun falling into wrong. Still others breathed that Rowan hadn't wrought aught at all except hold a mirror to the Thibodeau's souls, and they had ruined themselves when they couldn't bear what they beheld reflected there. The truth, as ever, was more tangled and more earthly than legend allowed. But the legend served its aim, reminding the bound that their lords were not unbreachable, that affliction and remorse could ruin even the mightiest, that sometimes endurance itself was a kind of triumph. Within a week of Evangeline's rites, Beaumont set plans to hawk Magnolia Grove. He met with seekers, bartered terms, took the first fair bid despite it being well under the land's true worth. Hecreved only to shed the place swift as able to set distance betwixt himself and the site of his ruin. Afore the trade sealed, he did 3 things. First, he bade the 3rd floor chamber where Evangeline had perished barred and locked. He had toiler shawl all the furnishings, scour the blood marks from the planks, though the marks ne'er quite vanished, no matter how fierce they scoured. Then he had the door locked and the key cast into the bayou with vows scribed into the trade pact that the chamber stay barred forever. The seeker, a trader from Lafayette, deemed it a queer bid, but yielded ready enough. What did he heed about one barred chamber in a abode with 20 others? Second, Beaumont methodically raised every scroll tied to Rowan. Deeds of claim, mender's notes, personal ledgers, missives with Dr. Caldwell. He kindled a blaze in his study hearth and fed the papers into it one by one, watching years of marks turn to ash. He burned Evangeline's journal too. Though he ne'er read it first, He couldn't bear to behold his own deeds echoed through her eyes, to grasp how she had felt what they had wrought. Third, he hawked most of the bound workers with the land, scattering them to varied seekers across the parish. Kin were sundered, communities shattered, lives upturned once more, to serve the ease of those who held them. Beaumont felt a distant remorse about this, grasping on some plane that he was dealing fresh wound on folk who had already endured much. But remorse altered naught. He craved coin to begin anew, and bound were chattel to be sold like any asset. But he kept rowing. When queried why, he had no fine answer. Maybe because Rowan was the sole other soul who truly grasped what had befallen, the lone witness to his utter fall. Maybe because some part of him still sensed that queer captivation, that hunger to hold what he couldn't fathom. Or maybe it was simply because he couldn't envision Rowan belonging to another, being yielded to another lord's wonder or harshness. He shifted to a wee abode in Thibodeau with just 3 bound, Rowan and 2 aged attendants too worn to fetch fine sums at bid. It was a humble dwelling on a still lane, not like the splendor of Magnolia. Beaumont dwelled there like a recluse, scarce venturing out save for needed tasks, shunning all gentry calls, withdrawing wholly from the realm of Louisiana's planter gentry that had once shaped his whole being. His neighbors sometimes beheld him treading solitary in the early morn hours, moving with the slow shuffling step of a far elder man, his shoulders bent as if bearing an unseen burden. He uttered to none, made no kin, joined no community rites. He simply lingered, going through the motions of abiding without any clear aim or joy. Rowan dwelled in a wee chamber on the 2nd level of the abode, still lawful Beaumont's chattel, but no longer yielded to the afflictive heed that had marked their tie at Magnolia. They scarce uttered to each other. When they did tie, it was with formal courtesy. Beaumont given simple bids about abode duties, Rowan obeying with quiet command. The dreadful closeness they had shared at Magnolia was gone, swapped by a vast gap that neither could span even if they had craved. The tie had changed into something near queerer than what had come afore. They were lord and bound in the eyes of the law, but indeed they were more like 2 specters haunting the same abode, passing each other without truly binding, tied by shared past neither could flee, but both direly craved to bury. Sometimes late at night when he couldn't slumber, Beaumont would stand outside Rowan's door with his palm raised to rap, craving something, grasping maybe, some nod that what had befallen betwixt them had been real, had signified, had meant something beyond mere using and ruin. But he ne'er rapped. He would stand there for long breaths, his palm trembling in the air, then turn away and return to his own chamber without making a sound. Rowan, lying awake on the other side of that door, knew he lingered, could hear his breathing, sense his aura, feel the weight of his unuttered crave. But Rowan ne'er opened the door, ne'er offered the solace or facing Beaumont might have sought. There was naught to utter that hadn't already been uttered, naught to offer that could shift what had befallen or make it signify other than what it was. The moons passed slow in that abode of specters and hush. Beaumont aged swift, his locks going gray, his visage gaunt, his eyes gaining the hollow gaze of one who had ceased seeing any aim in enduring to linger. He sipped, though not to o'er, just enough to blur the rims of memory to make slumber feasible on the nights when remorse and sorrow threatened to swallow him. Wholly, Beaumont Thibodeau passed in his slumber on the morn of November 3rd, 1852, 9 moons after Evangeline's passing. The mender who was called to probe the form found no clear cause of death, no ailment, no wound, no mark of venom or strife. His heart had simply ceased throbbing, as if he had settled during the night that abiding craved more toil than he could muster, and his form had yieldingly complied with that settle. Sometimes the mender noted in his scroll with the careful remove of learned sight, a man can perish of a shattered spirit as sure as from a shattered bone. The will to abide is a riddled thing, and when it flees, the form oft follows soon after. I hold that is what befell here. Rowan was hawked at bid with the other holdings of Beaumont's we hold. The abode, the furnishings, the 2 aged attendants. The bound went for $4.12, a pittance of what Beaumont had first paid, because by then murmurs about Rowan's queer nature had spread through the local kin, and seekers were wary of aught tied to the Thibodeau woe. The soul who claimed Rowan was a tiller from Assumption Parish, who craved aboded and put scant faith in what he shunned as folly gossip. What became of Rowan after is unknown. The chronicled trace goes silent as it does for so many bound souls whose lives and passings were deemed too slight to scribe. There are no further deeds of claim, no hold tallies, no parish ledgers that note a bound match in Rowan's mark. The soul simply faded into the vast shadow of the American bound order, becoming one of millions whose tales were ne'er scribed, whose suffering left no formal mark beyond breathed legends and barred scrolls. Maybe Rowan at last found release somehow through flight to the north, through the storm of the near and civil strife, through eventual freeing when it came. Maybe Rowana bidded a long life under a fresh name in a place where none knew the tale of Magnolia Grove, where being other was no longer a wonder to be probed, but simply one shade among many in the endless weave of human being. Maybe Rowan found some measure of peace, some path to mend from the violation endured at the hands of Beaumont and Evangeline Thibodeau. Or maybe not. Maybe Rowan abided the rest of a brief life, passed from lord to lord, probed and used by each in turn, Persian young and forgotten in some unmarked plot. History is brimming with folk who suffered without redeem, without right, without mendin', without even the solace of being recalled. We crave to hold that Rowan endured, that somehow this soul who bore so much at last found release in peace. But we simply don't know. And the hush of the chronicled trace may be answer enough. Magnolia Grove stood vacant for 3 years, afore being claimed by the trader from Lafayette who had hawked it from Beaumont. The freshholder moved in with his kin, set to mend the hold to its old flourish. But within weeks, queer claims began flowing. The barred chamber on the 3rd level grieved all who passed it in the corridor. There was a chill spot by the door that ne'er warmed, even in summer's blaze. And sometimes folk claimed hearing sounds from within, though the chamber had been empty and locked for years. Against the vows of the first trade, the freshholder at last had the chamber opened, wonder overcoming his accord to leave it barred. Inside, toilers found marks of what had befallen there. Dark stains on the planks that no scouring had lifted, scars on the walls where furnishings had stood. An air so heavy that the men who entered shunned lingering longer than needed. They stripped the chamber wholly, swapped the planks, repainted the walls, but the freshholder's kin claimed they could ne'er quite shake the feeling that something dreadful had befallen in that space. Some echo of strife and despair that lingered despite all tries to bury it. The hold changed hands 4 more times o'er the next decade, each holder abiding only brief afore hawking at loss and treading on. Tales began to flow about the land, about queer sounds in the night, about shadows that stirred in ways shadows shouldn't stir, about a presence that filled certain chambers with unvoiced dread. Each next holder tried to shun these tales as folly nonsense, the sort of yarns that gather round any old abode. But each at last hawked the land for less than they'd paid, and each quietly warned the next seeker that something was amiss with the place, though they could ne'er quite voice what. By 1865, during the storm of the Civil War's final moons, when Union and Confederate forces swept to and fro across Louisiana, the great house burned under circumstances that were near rightly explained. Some uttered it was Union troops passing the bayou. Others claimed it was local folk who had grown weary of the house's dark name and settled to end it once for all. Still others breathed that the house had simply ruined itself, that the burden of what had befallen there had grown too much for plaster and beam to bear, and the blaze had sparked from within. Only the base and a few sheds endured the fire. These lingered for another 2 decades, slowly rotten afore being finally swallowed by thicket and underbrush as nature reclaimed soil that humans had forsaken. Today naught remains of Magnolia Grove except a few crumbling plaster bases scarce seen beneath decades of leaf rot and creeping vines. The soil is privately held, marked with no trespass signs that are carefully upheld, though none seems to know who upholds them or why. Local chroniclers nod that a grove once stood there, that the Thibodeau kin abided and perished on that land. But details about the grove's past are notably absent from parish ledgers, as if someone long ago wrought a methodic try to bury the place from formal recall. The barred parish scrolls tied to the Thibodeau woe